Hello dear students, in this lesson we will learn what is a static keyword. We will talk about where we can use static keyword. I will explain you how we can use static methods, static fields. In this lesson you are going to learn what is static import and what is the difference between static and dynamic binding. Let's start. I truly believe that to learn this topic better we can jump to the examples. So first of all, where you can use static keyword. You already saw in previous lessons that you can use static keyword during class declaration, with initialization blocks, with methods and with properties. Static keyword controls variable lifetime. I believe you remember static nested classes, and we even discussed how to create object of static nested classes. Let's understand what static is on this simple example. You have the user class. It has such properties as ID and name. And one property has static modifier. Counter field is static. During initialization of each new object, I increment counter. Now, let's try to create two objects of user type and investigate what will be the value of counter and ID fields. Here you see I created user number 1 and user number 2. I get user ID and counter value from the first and the second user. Let me run this program and we will investigate with you console output. You see that both users have ID with 0 value, because 0 is the default value for int variable. But counter is not the same. At the beginning counter is equal to 1, and after we see that counter is equal to 2. And even more interesting things. If I would call getCounter method on the user1 object, I will get 2. Why? Because static variable exists in the single copy, and it belongs not to the object, but to the whole class. Each time new object is created, this counter variable is incremented. And taking into account that it exists in single copy, each time new object is created, the value become more and more. You know that class is a template for future object, and each new object will have a new ID property. But static fields are not connected with the objects. They are connected with the class. That's why each object knows about class properties. And when I call getCounter method for the second user and getCounter method for the first user, I receive the value of the same variable. Let's move on. Imagine that our user has a child class, employee. Both user and employee have static method with the same name, do any static action. The only difference is that console output is different. Here I print user class name to console, and here I print employee. Now let's create object of employee type, and let's call the static method. What will be printed to console? If you answered that user class name will be printed to console, then you are right. Why it works this way? This is called static binding. The method which will be called is already known during the compilation time. It is known because I call static method, something what belongs to the class, but not to the object. That's why if I have variable of type user here, static method of the type user will be invoked. And you see that Eclipse highlights for us this method call. It tells me that static method should be accessed in a different way. In which way? Indifferent. Usually to access any static entities you use class name, like this, user class, and after that you call any static method you wish. Let's call static method of user type and employee type. The example which we discussed in polymorphism, when we override some method, called dynamic binding, because the method which should be executed will be identified during the runtime based on the object that will be behind the reference. And I believe now you understood that dynamic binding is not possible with static methods. You can't override static methods. Static often considered as a bad thing in object-oriented programming. Why? Because it violates such basic OOP principle as polymorphism. It doesn't allow to override behavior which is the key for OOP. Also, during building of a class hierarchy, it is not recommended to have static methods and fields to not get confused that multiple objects sharing similar properties. Also, sometimes static behavior and static state harder to test. But you will understand this later when we will learn how to write integration and unit tests. Obviously, you can use static methods in your code, and you can find in GDK that static methods are pretty widespread thing. But be prepared that when you will be on your workplace, your team lead won't be happy to see all static methods in your code. During this course, I will share with you architectural and code design approach which relies on the OOP principles where static entities are not used. But now you know what static keyword means. Knowing this, you can understand why constants have modifiers static and final. That is because static means that this field exists in a single copy, and final means that nobody can change the value of this variable after this variable was declared. So here you can see that I have the compilation error when I try to assign a new value to the final variable. I believe you remember a lot about final keyword from the lesson about polymorphism. For now, you already understand why constants have static final modifier. We will not discuss static initialization blocks in this lesson because we discussed them during the inheritance topic when I showed you example of order initialization of an object. Feel free to check that lesson if you want to recall information about static initialization blocks. The last but not the least thing for today, what I wanted to discuss with you is a static import. It is pretty simple. For example, do you remember arrays class? It contains only static methods, and to call any static method you need to write arrays class name and then call any method you would like. But what if you don't want to write arrays every time? You can import all static entities from arrays class. How to do that? On the top of your file write this: import static java util arrays dot and asterisk. This symbol means that you want to import all static entities that exist in this class. By saying all, I mean methods, fields, that is what you will use. And now you can call, for example, sort method without writing arrays class name. It looks like that's it according to our agenda. Let's recap what we have learned today. Today we learned how static keyword works with fields and methods. We discussed what is static and dynamic binding. Now you know why static considered to be a bad thing in OOP. Hope you understood how to declare your own constants variables. Also, you learned how to import static in your Java file. That's it. Thank you for your attention and see you in the next lesson.